Thank you very much, Michiel, and let me echo what you said in the beginning about the excellent cooperation in the Food Secure team on the preparation and running of the workshops. That went really well and was a pleasure to do, and we look forward to continuing that. Also in others, I think we had a discussion. Whom did we invite, to these workshops? Who are the stakeholders? All these things that you already heard about, the scenarios. Now, where do they come from? All these friends and family that we got together, and think a little bit about left and right. It was from the beginning a very careful selection that we did of the stakeholders, and you see here the grouping by sector. Through basically also the value chain from inputs to aid, disaster relief, and insurance. You see how they, in the different workshops they had, the first two on the scenario development, building one on the other, and then the others basically in terms of the topic in parallel between the international group and the EU group on visions and options, and you see how the distribution was there. This distribution in principle is intended. Of course, sometimes you get simply to the fact that people get sick at the last moment or forget their passport at home. You get sometimes some variation because it's a very small group, but we very carefully drafted the idea, whom do we need there at which workshop in order for us to do a good job. And the same is true here for the organizational affiliation. And he'd already mentioned the different kind of organizations that we've seen from business economy, government authority, which you see are stronger represented certainly in the EU visions and options workshop, and were a little bit balanced before. So there we also wanted this EU vision from government and options for policy from government, but also from a business and economy perspective, and equally, of course, civil society, research and academia, and practitioners that we didn't want to forget in the whole package as well. So very good group of participants we got together, and where we can claim that this is perhaps not representative in the sense of being statistically representative and reaching those levels beyond 1,000 participants. That's not really possible in this setting, but giving a good overview of different perspectives in society that we need for this. Now, those are the results of what people have said after the workshop, when they've done it, not before. And we've asked them, how do you rate the workshop in general? In the first scenario workshop, we still had 10 people who said it was okay. That okay basically disappeared from this list, which is, of course, very good. And you see that the amount of people that said it was very good even reached the level of 80%. I think when we're having the next workshop, we need to go for something Soviet style. But we're not there. No, and this, of course, is a joke. So we're extremely happy with those 80% saying this was a very good workshop. And you see also a certain evolution. Of course, at the beginning, you remember the story about the scenario development where we tried to work with the IPCC scenarios, which the stakeholders didn't want. We had to change the process. Of course, there is was a different reception, which was still very good in our overall view of this, but actually increased further in the process. And if you then go to the process of the workshops, that is a little bit reflected in the beginning as well, where we still had some 19% of people who said it was okay for the vision and options workshops in Vienna, but again a 70% rate for the one in Malta on the European Visions and Option workshop. Now you might think about how is that difference between the last ones, how could that come about? And might be a little bit of a view on this comes from looking then at the questions, to what extent do you feel that you and your fellow participants identified and structured insightful policy options during this workshop? And then you see that the Europeans had a slightly different view on this, than the international participants as well. So still a very good result. And perhaps a little bit is an effect that we can see here in general. Of course, when you start to talk about possible and potential futures and external factors, that's one thing. When you get down to the business, what do we need to do differently? That's more difficult. It's more important in the end because that's where we want to go, and we need the scenarios in order to do this. but it's more difficult. And perhaps we see a little bit of a UN effect here, which you can also see coming back in the policies that have been worked out in the Vienna workshop, where it was much more difficult for participants to agree on what really needs to be done when we talk about governance as one issue than in the European workshop. So the more different players you have on board, the more difficult it is to agree, not necessarily on the analysis, but certainly on the actions. But that doesn't mean that we didn't get to interesting things. So these are some of the comparisons now we can make between the international workshops, so with a more international perspective and more international players there, and a European workshop where it's more European players there. And we see actually, if we compare them, that was also one of the ideas of having them in parallel, so to say, even in time difference, but with different participants, is to see, are there any differences that we can see? And you see that there are many points that participants share. Actually, they did surprise us, because we did only allocate a rather small amount of time for this step. And then the richness of answers that came from participants about their vision of how they would like the future to look like in terms of food and nutrition security was much more than we expected. So we had to rearrange the process again a little bit, but that's part of doing the job right. Now, if you see the comparison here, so many things that are very similar, but if on the international side we talk a little bit more about infrastructure that needs to be available, and on the European side it's more the innovative technology. So it goes a little bit into different directions here and there. All beings versus food for all, and then consumers making informed and educated choices. And on the other hand of the international, it's just the informed choices, so the education seems to be a little less. Now, but that is really a side aspect. So they are very, very similar to a large extent. You see sometimes further going differences in terms of zero waste versus minimized food waste, really zero waste in the European sense. And so transparency of externalities that are supposed to come in. Landscape aspects, so cultural aspects that play much more obviously in Europe than they are in the international scene, at least with this group of participants, again, which is a small selection. Now then, coming to the key options, and we are not there that we can present you the full picture yet, because we're in the moment, at this very moment, still finalizing this report, so you get much more of this if you want to and have a look at later on. But this is just a glimpse of the kind of issues that we've talked about, and behind each of those words is a set of 10, 20 different ideas that have been brought forward by the participants. And some of these have also been worked out much more in detail, not all of them. And there you see also some issues that are coming back. Taxation is one. The issue of resilience and disaster prevention came back in both, but very strongly on the international side, a little bit less on the European, but still. Education was also very much an issue. And then this points such as alternative business models, investment and financial systems, all grouped together. There were many ideas which were very peculiar also on the European side. And just to give you one glimpse of what then could be behind one of those points, two in fact, let me give you this one from the European level, both of them, governments and governance. Stakeholders there said what we need is actually circular governance that with actually two levels, a higher level logic that builds coordination between countries, sets framework standards and benchmarking for food and nutrition security, and then a lower level logic which is actually allows a different range of different approaches to be tested out and followed, and which focuses on issues such as supply chain robustness and private-public interfaces and so forth. And then another interesting point was very much underlying the discussion of participants, the focus on resource efficiency, and they want the next CAP to address this, so we're getting very concrete, and they had some very concrete ideas about that as well. They're supported by an accepted resource accounting approach, so that we're actually able to quantify what we put into the food process. And then another question, which perhaps is always good to notice if stakeholders ask for research. Now here they did again, and they said we need more research into the true costs of food, because that was a big discussion with stakeholders. What is the true cost? Now I don't know if there's going to be ever an answer to that question, but at least some more research is something that the stakeholders would like to see. And just as another example of what can come out, education. Mandatory nutrition science courses for both genders. I let that leave it like that. Education where you eat, also at the workplace. So an idea that in Europe, this was again from the European workshop, we need to educate people in the companies, in the organizations where they work. So in your cafeterias and mensas, and there should be the education on a nutrition that is much better suited. It's much more in the report, much more to pick up if you want to pick up, because this is what the stakeholders provided to Food Secure without being paid for it, except for the ticket and their meals and their hotels. They spent their time to work on this with us. So this, we believe, and I hope I speak for the team, is valuable material that can link up to many things that we have developed also outside, obviously, the stakeholder process within Food Secure. Quickly, there is one more final stakeholder workshop before the final conference that we can do, and that is next year. And we've discussed before today, and actually also again over lunch today, and deepen that discussion. And this is ideas at the moment. These are ideas what we'd like to do. So please go ahead and tell us what you think about them. This is the right time to do this. It's a week-long event with stakeholders participating for part of the time, so we don't think we can get them for 1 week. Don't worry, for much less, but it's a week-long event that we can have in principle. They would come for part of that time. We have thought about using an early version of the Navigator, the instrument at the end of the Food Secure process, that could serve as a background tool for the discussions and informing them. And the focus of the workshop would be a road mapping, but we would be selective, more selective than you could otherwise use road mapping methodologies, which there are, and they're also tested. So that as such is not a problem, but for our specific case, we were thinking about using selected policy options that both stakeholders plus the Food Secure project find most interesting to look at, and then to go into a time planning process and see how can we roadmap these over time in order to reach at least some parts of the visions that we have identified. So we would like to bring together at this final stakeholder workshop the analyzation, the strategizing, with the outputs from the stakeholder process, the scenarios, the visions, the options, but also, of course, the Food Secure toolbox, so modeling information that we can have there, and of course, further specialized evidence from the Food Secure project, also that was not yet linked in any way directly to this stakeholder process. So this is in principle the idea, and the timing would be April, May next year. We would go for mixing with the participants we already have and selecting some of those with very policy-savvy participants in order to improve our basis further. And we also foresee lots of exchange with the resource persons, because you got to know, if you haven't been there, it's a bit of a frustration for the resource persons to be there, because stakeholders really, it's about the stakeholders, this process, so they talk. And the role of all of us is to support that. So here we're looking forward to really have an interaction. This is the moment to really bring the different sides of the Food Secure project together and agree on what could be key messages and what could be the key policy recommendations that come from this. Not part of the workshop would be then a feedback session with stakeholders on the monitoring results of the scenarios. We do that before. Also a testing of the handling of the Navigator with Tom before, and then possibly if we web feedback session also with stakeholders on the policy modeling after this workshop, if this is of interest. That's our proposal. The rest with reporting. This is our proposal of, at this moment, what we'd like to do. Well, not perhaps proposal is even said too much, ideas at this moment. This is where we converged over before this meeting and over lunch, and we look definitely forward to your comments.